The first thing Clem Purcell did when he came to Agnes Briarfield's door was take off his hat. That was how she knew something had changed. In 20 years of being neighbors in Calhoun County, Kansas, Clem Purcell had never once removed his hat in her presence. He had kept it on at the feed store, and at the co-op, and at the Methodist church potluck, where everyone else uncovered their heads out of basic courtesy. He had kept it on the morning he came up her lane in 1972 with his wife's casserole dish and a smile he thought looked sympathetic. He had kept it on every time he drove past her creek and called across the wheat about puddles and grandchildren. Now he was standing on her porch with the hat in both hands, turning the brim in slow circles, and his shoulders had come down from where they usually lived, which was somewhere around his ears when he was feeling confident, which had been most of his adult life. Agnes looked at him through the screen door for a moment before she opened it. She took in the weight he had lost over the summer, the way his clean blue shirt hung on him differently than it would have in April, the particular quality of exhaustion in a man's face when he has spent 3 months watching something he cannot control take everything he spent years building. She opened the door. "Come in," she said. "The wind is blowing dust." He came in. But to understand what it meant that Clem Purcell was standing in Agnes Briarfield's kitchen with his hat in his hands in the summer of 1982, you have to go back 6 years. You have to go back to the April morning when the wheat was knee-high and green and moving in the wind, the way it had moved across Calhoun County for 10,000 years before anyone showed up with a plow. And 4 men were standing at a fence line watching a 67-year-old widow measure a creek. The wheat did not care who was watching. The wheat just grew. Agnes Briarfield was standing ankle-deep in Kettle Creek on the 23rd of April, 1976, with the cold water sliding around her rubber boots and a knotted measuring rope in her left hand, and a small leather notebook tucked in her shirt pocket. She was 67 years old. She was a widow. She owned 420 acres of Kansas farmland, and she had been measuring this particular stretch of creek on the 23rd of every April since her father first put the rope in her hands in 1925 and told her that the creek would tell her what the year was going to be if she was willing to listen. She was listening now. The 4 men at the fence line were not listening. They were laughing. Clem Purcell was the loudest. He was 60 years old that spring, broad across the chest, red in the face from the wind and from the particular pleasure that certain men took in being wrong out loud in front of other men. His John Deere cap was pushed back on his head. His left boot was up on the bottom rail of the fence, and he was pointing at the creek the way a man pointed at a circus act. He said Agnes Briarfield was going to build herself a dam. The man beside him, Thaddeus Briggs, who ran the co-op and laughed at whatever Clem laughed at, because that was how he had always understood friendship to work, laughed first and loudest. The other 2 men followed one because he was a serious man who didn't often get permission to be silly, and a young hired hand who hadn't yet earned his own opinion about anything. "You are going to spend your summer," Clem called, "across the wheat stacking rocks, so you can hold water. You are going to get anyway." Agnes wrote a number in her notebook. She moved 6 feet upstream. She measured again. She wrote another number. She did not look at the fence line. She did not need to. She could hear every word, and she let every word pass through her, the way the creek water passed around her boots, present and cold and ultimately going somewhere else. The number she had just written was 4 inches lower than the same reading on the same date in 1975. It was 1 inch lower than 1974. It was 5 inches lower than 1965. Nobody else in Calhoun County had those numbers. Nobody else had been standing in this specific stretch of water on this specific date for 51 consecutive years. But Agnes had been. And what those numbers told her when she laid them side by side on her kitchen table, under the kerosene lamp, the way she had been doing since her father died in 1959, was something nobody in the county had yet said out loud. The wet cycles were getting shorter. The dry years were coming closer together. What had once been one drought decade in 5 was becoming 1 in 3. The creek ran lower every spring than it had the spring before. Not dramatically, not the way a storm announced itself, the way a person aged, the way a house settled. Quiet, steady, the kind of change you would miss unless you had been looking at 50 years of gauge readings and had been taught by a man who trusted both the land and his daughter to look. She had been looking since 1925, and what she saw scared her enough to spend her summer stacking rocks. The farmhouse was 3/4 of a mile from the creek, white-clappered with a tin roof patched in 2 places, and a wraparound porch that Walter had rebuilt the summer before he died. Walter Briarfield had been a careful man with a hammer. His porch boards still met clean. 5 years after his heart had stopped in the south field, the joints he had cut were still true. Agnes climbed the porch steps without removing her wet boots. She walked through the front room into the kitchen and set the notebook on the table next to a coffee cup that had gone cold. Then she stood, just stood, in the way that people who lived alone stood sometimes when the house was too quiet and the thought they were carrying was too large to keep moving with. A letter was on the table beside the notebook. It had arrived 3 days before. Her son Emmett's handwriting on the envelope slanted to the right, the way Walter's had slanted. 4 pages inside, written in the careful language of a man who had been composing something for a long time and had finally decided to send it. Agnes did not pick up the letter. She had read it enough times to know what it said, without reading it again. The substance of the letter was this: she was 67 years old. She had been working 420 acres alone since Walter died. The land was more than one person could properly manage. Clem Purcell had made a fair offer, a number Emmett had included in the second paragraph, a number that acknowledged the quality of the ground and the years of improvement her father and husband had made to it. Emmett lived in Wichita. He was not coming back to farm. Perhaps it was time to let someone else have the land who could give it the attention it deserved. Agnes picked up the letter. She folded it twice and put it in the kitchen drawer with the ball of twine and the seed packets from last year and the church bulletin from Walter's funeral. She went out to the equipment shed and found Nesbitt Mosley. Nesbitt was 62 years old. He had a face shaped by decades of outdoor work and hands that had not been fully cleaned since sometime in the middle of the previous decade. He had come to work for Agnes's father the summer her brother Boyd died, and he had never left. He had been here 19 years through the farm's seasons and its losses, and its ordinary days, living in the bunk room behind the barn, eating breakfast in Agnes's kitchen at 6 in the morning, working whatever needed working without being asked and without complaint. He looked up when she came into the shed. He saw her face. He said, "How much rock?" That was the conversation. 11 words between them. Because some conversations between people who had worked together for 19 years did not need more than 11 words. She said, 4 feet wide, 4 feet high at the deep place. Nesbitt wiped his hands on a rag. He said limestone or sandstone. She said limestone from the quarry on the east fence line. He said clay. She said creek bottom. He said when. She said after the wheat comes in and before the corn needs cultivating. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He said, "All right, Mrs. Briarfield." He had been calling her Mrs. Briarfield for 19 years. She had asked him in 1962 to call her Agnes, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man asked to do something that violated his understanding of how the world was organized. So she had stopped asking. She did not mind. Some things did not need changing. She went back to the house. She wrote in her notebook under the gauge, reading from that morning. Nesbit agreed. Start second week of May. God help us. God help. Then she sat down and made a list of stones she would need, calculating the volume of the wall she intended to build, working through the arithmetic her father had taught her. The same way he had taught her to read the creek with patience and precision, and no particular hurry because the numbers would be what they were. Regardless of how fast she got to them, she had been teaching herself patience since 1925. She had been teaching herself precision since before that. Her father, Harlan Briarwood, had homesteaded these 420 acres in 1901. He had drilled the first well and built the first barn, and lost the first crop to hail, and survived the dry years of the teens by storing water in a hand-dug pond behind the machine shed. He had driven a gauge stake into the bank of Kettle Creek, below the big sycamore in 1903, the year Agnes was born, and he had begun measuring the water level every year on the 23rd of April. He had taught Agnes to take those measurements in 1925, when she was 16 years old. She had thought at the time that he was teaching her because she was his daughter, and he loved her and wanted her to know the land the way he knew it. She had thought this for 18 years, accompanying him to the creek on Saturday mornings and Sunday afternoons and evenings when supper was finished, learning to read what he was reading in the numbers, learning the language of a particular stretch of water on a particular piece of Kansas ground. Then her brother Boyd died in 1943. Boyd Briarwood was 36 years old when the tractor took him on a wet spring slope in the North Field on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He had a wife in town and a baby coming. The wife moved back to Missouri after the baby was born. The baby was a boy who would grow up not knowing his grandfather's land. Harlan Briarwood sat at his kitchen table the night of Boyd's funeral and looked across at his daughter, who was 34 years old and married to a young man named Walter Whitfield, and said, "You will have to learn it all now." And Agnes understood in that moment, sitting across from her father at the table with the kerosene lamp between them and the sounds of the September night coming through the screen door, that he had been teaching her since 1925, not because she was his daughter, but because some part of him, some old farming part that read weather and read land and read the slope of a field and a wet spring morning, had known something, had known enough to teach 2 children instead of 1, just in case. Harlan Briarwood died in 1959. He left Agnes the land and the equipment and the deed and 47 years of weather notebooks. She kept the notebooks going. By April of 1976, she had 73 years of continuous weather records for this specific piece of ground in her kitchen cabinet, bound in brown leather, stacked the way her father had stacked them, oldest on the left. The first Friday of May was Co-op Day in Calhoun County. Every farmer who considered himself one came to the Kettle Creek Co-op on the first Friday of every month. They came for coffee that was bad, and for seed prices that were worse, and for the conversation that was the same conversation they had been having for 40 years. Because some conversations became a form of continuity, and continuity was its own kind of comfort when the weather was uncertain and the market was unpredictable, and the land was always asking more than a person expected to give. Agnes came too. She always came. Not coming would have said something she was not interested in saying, so she came and bought what she needed and said what was necessary to say and went home. She drove the Ford pickup Walter had bought in 1964, the one with the bench seat and the radio that only received AM. She parked at the side of the building She walked across the gravel in her work boots, the only shoes that fit her feet comfortably anymore, and a clean cotton dress and a sweater because the May morning still had a bite to it, and she carried the small handbag that had belonged to her mother. She walked through the door. The bell rang. Several heads turned and turned back, and there it was on the bulletin board right next to the auction flyers and the church notices and the seed variety information. A cartoon hand-drawn in pen and ink, a stick figure in a long dress and a wide-brimmed hat stacking rocks in a creek, while a fat cloud poured rain down from above. Beneath the cartoon in block letters that someone had taken some care, with Briarfield Waterworks, holding back the heavens. Since 1976, Agnes looked at it. She looked at it for 3 seconds. She counted them because she had learned over 67 years that a person could spend exactly as long as she chose to on something that was trying to cost her more than she had decided to spend. Then she walked to the counter. Thaddeus Briggs was behind it, 48 years old, with the look of a man who had just seen someone arrive at a party he had organized for their discomfort. He arranged his face into something pleasant. He said, "Morning, Agnes." She said, "Morning, Thaddeus. I need 10 pounds of Pioneer seed corn, the 3306, and a box of Dixon Ticonderoga pencils, number 2. He asked if she wanted it on her account. She said she was paying cash that day. He counted her change twice. She let him. She picked up the seed corn. She picked up the pencils. She turned around. The cartoon was still on the board. 2 men at the bench by the window were watching her over their coffee cups. She walked out. Nesbitt was at the truck. He took the seed corn. He put it in the bed. He got in on the passenger side. He asked if she had seen the picture. She said she had. He asked if she wanted him to pull it down. She said no. He said, "All right." She started the truck and drove home. The windows were down, and the May wind came in across the young wheat. And Agnes thought about her father. She thought about something he had told her in 1934, when she was 25 years old, and had lost a baby in the 7th month, and the grief of it was still sitting on her chest like a stone. He had said, "People are going to be wrong about you your whole life, Eleanor. The trick is not to make them right." She had been Eleanor to her father. Everyone else had called her Agnes since she was a child. She had not understood what he meant when he said it. She had been 25 years old, and she understood grief, but not yet the particular patience required to be right about something in a community that had decided otherwise. She was 67 years old now. She understood him fine. The second week of May, they started on the dam. They started at the narrowing below the big sycamore, where the limestone shelved out from both banks and gave them natural footing. That shelf had been there since before any European had set foot on this part of Kansas. The sycamore beside it was at least 120 years old, because Harlan Briarwood had measured its trunk in 1903 when he drove the gauge stake into the bank and had recorded the diameter in his first notebook, and Agnes had measured it again every 20 years, and the arithmetic confirmed what the tree itself suggested. Nesbitt drove the flatbed. Agnes drove the tractor with the front loader. They hauled limestone slabs out of the old quarry on the east fence line. 2 slabs at a time, brought them down to the creek, unloaded them by hand and by iron bar. 6 days a week. The 7th day they rested. Her father's rule. His father's rule before that. By the end of May, they had moved 78 slabs. Agnes kept the count in her notebook alongside the weather and the creek readings. Her hands cracked open along the heels. She wrapped them in gauze and kept working. Nesbitt wrapped his the same way without being asked. because that was how Nesbit understood everything. Do what needs doing, don't discuss it. Don't require recognition for the doing. What Agnes had not told Nesbit, not yet, was the full picture of why the dam mattered as much as it did. She had told him the practical part. The gauge readings, the trends she saw in the numbers, the dry years coming closer together. But she had not told him about Walter. She had not told anyone about Walter. What the doctor had said was that Walter Briarfield died of a cardiac event in the South Field on the 11th of August, 1971. He was 62 years old, and his heart had always been slightly unreliable, and the summer heat combined with the physical demands had been too much for it. What Agnes knew was different. 1971 had been a drought year, not the worst drought she had seen in her lifetime, not 1934 or 1936, but serious enough, the kind of dry that emptied the top of the soil and cracked the fields, and required hauling water from the well to the cattle and the crops every day from June through September. Agnes had watched Walter work that summer, with the specific watching of a wife who understood her husband's body, the way she understood the creek through close observation over many years. She had watched him work 18-hour days when he should have been working 12. She had watched him push through the July heat and the August heat because he was afraid of the bank and afraid of losing what her father had spent his life building on this ground. She had asked him to slow down. He had said, "I'm fine." She had believed him because she wanted to believe him. On the 11th of August, she found him in the South Field with the tractor engine still running, and the Kansas sky enormous and indifferent above him, and the dry ground under him. She had knelt beside him in the dirt and taken his hand before the ambulance came, before anyone else arrived, and she had made 3 promises in the specific way she had learned to make promises from her father. Not to God, who she was no longer entirely sure was listening to her in particular, but to the land itself and to the people who had given their lives to it. She promised her father's memory the gauge readings would continue. She promised Walter's vanishing warmth the land would survive the dry years. She promised her brother Boyd's ghost dead 28 years in the North Field. No one on this ground would be killed by a dry year again. That was what the dam was, not proof of anything. Not a statement to Clem Purcell or Thaddeus Briggs or anyone who had ever looked at a 67-year-old widow in a creek with a measuring rope and decided the sight was funny. It was a promise made to the dead on a hot August afternoon. The first week of June, Clem Purcell drove by the work site. He slowed but did not stop. He looked at them out the window. Nesbit bent at the waist setting a stone. Agnes ankle-deep in the creek packing clay between courses with her bare hands, the way her father's neighbor had taught him in 1903, the way knowledge moved in farming communities from one pair of hands to the next without ceremony or fanfare. Clem drove on. The second week of June, he stopped. He rolled down his window and called across the field, "That's coming along, Eleanor." She straightened up and wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the fence line. He asked how big she was planning to make it. She said 40 feet wide, 4 feet at the deep place, about 9 acre-feet of storage when it fills. He laughed. He laughed the way he laughed in April, with his chest open and his head back, and the pleasure of a man who needed an audience, even when no audience was present, except the wind. He said he was going to send his grandchildren down to swim in her puddle. Agnes looked at him with the specific quality of attention she brought to weather she could not change. She said, "Drive safe, Clem." She walked back to the creek. He sat in his car for another minute. She did not turn to see whether he was watching. She could hear him. She had heard him since April. She simply did not require anything from the hearing. That night she wrote in her notebook, June 14th. Clem came by. Same as before. Nesbit pretended not to hear him. Nesbit is a kinder man than he receives credit for being. Stone place today, 11. Running total, 174. Pool depth at gauge will reach 4 feet by the 3rd week of July if the rains hold. They will hold. They are holding now. She closed the notebook. She put out the lamp. She went upstairs to the room she had shared with Walter for 39 years and lay down on her side of the bed, which she had kept to since 1971. Even though there was no longer any reason to confine herself to one half. She did not sleep for an hour and 20 minutes. Then she did because the body required sleep regardless of what the mind was carrying. And Agnes had learned a long time ago that accepting what was required of you was more useful than resisting it. The next morning, while she was at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee and the notebook open to the previous evening's entry, someone knocked on the front door. Not the back porch door, which was how Nesbit came in at 6 every morning to start the coffee. The front door. Agnes froze for a second because nobody had come to the front door since Walter's funeral. The front door was for occasions, not for ordinary mornings. She put down her cup. She walked through the front room. She opened the door. A young woman was standing on the porch. She was perhaps 26 years old. Her hair was the color of new straw pulled back in a knot that was not entirely successful at containing it. She was holding a basket covered with a checked cloth, and beneath the cloth was the smell of bread. Fresh bread that someone had made that morning in a kitchen that was not Agnes's. The young woman looked at Agnes directly. This was not a universal quality in people who came to Agnes Briarfield's door. Most people who had come over the years had looked at her with the peripheral quality of people who were uncertain of their welcome and were managing that uncertainty through oblique attention. This woman had none of that. She was looking at Agnes the way Agnes looked at the creek gauge directly, and with the intention of reading what was actually there, rather than what she hoped to find. She said, "Mrs. Briarfield." Agnes said yes. The young woman said, "My name is Eudora Hanley. My husband is Roy Hanley. He farms the section east of the county road north of Creek Bend." Agnes knew Roy Hanley. Quiet young man, 29 years old, had inherited his father's place in 1973. She had seen him at the co-op the last time she was there. He had been standing near the bulletin board when Agnes walked in. He had not laughed. He had looked at the cartoon and looked at Agnes, and then looked at the floor, which was its own kind of statement. Agnes said, "I know your husband." Eudora Hanley said he doesn't know. "I'm here." Agnes let the silence sit for a moment. Eudora said, "My father worked for your father in 1920. He was 19. He helped dig the second pond, the one behind the machine shed." Agnes said, "What was his name?" Eudora said, "Marlin Combs." Agnes closed her eyes for 1 second. Marlin Combs. She remembered him. Slow and kind with a stammer that got worse when he was nervous, which was often because he was a nervous young man in a household that moved at the speed of Harlan Briarwood's attention. And Harlan Briarwood's attention was considerable. He had eaten Sunday supper with the family 3 or 4 times, when Agnes was 11 and 12, sitting across from her at the long table, passing the bread without being asked and saying almost nothing, and looking comfortable saying almost nothing. She had assumed he had died. She had not kept track. She said, "Your father was a good man." Eudora said, "He's still alive, ma'am. He's 75. Agnes said, "Oh." She said it small. She said it the way a person said something when they had just learned something embarrassing about the assumptions they made about the world. Marlin Combs was 75 years old, alive. and his daughter was standing on Agnes Briarfield's porch with a basket of fresh bread and the direct gaze of someone who had come to ask something real. Eudora held up the basket. She said, "I brought bread and I have a question. If you have time, I know you don't owe me time." Agnes looked at the young woman standing on her porch at 8 in the morning, 26 years old or so, holding a question and a basket of bread she had made that morning, standing in front of a 67-year-old widow without apology or performance, just directness and a specific kind of seriousness that Agnes recognized because she had been told her whole life she wore it herself. Agnes opened the door wider. She said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Agnes moved the notebook aside. Eudora set the basket down and folded back the cloth, and the smell of the bread filled the kitchen properly. Agnes realized she had not had a piece of bread baked by another person's hands since Walter died. She had not noticed until this moment how long that was. She put the kettle on. She made coffee. She did not ask the question yet. She let the young woman have the time she needed, because Agnes had learned that people arrived at important things faster when they were not rushed toward them, when the coffee was poured, when the bread was cut, when both women had something warm in front of them. Eudora Hanley said, "My father told me your father was the most careful man he ever knew." Agnes said he was a careful man. Eudora said, "He said your father could walk a creek bank in February and tell you whether June would be wet or dry." Agnes said he could. Eudora said, "I want to know what you see that they don't." Agnes set down her cup. She looked at the young woman across her table, the bread between them, the coffee, the morning light coming through the east window at the angle it came through every June morning, the same angle it had come through when her father sat at this table, and when his father sat at it before that. She thought for one moment about making the conversation small, about saying she was just an old woman with a project everyone thought was foolish, about protecting herself in the way she had learned to protect herself over 6 years of cartoons on bulletin boards and men laughing from fence lines. Then she thought about Marlin Combs, slow, kind, stammering Marlin Combs, who was 75 years old and still alive, and had told his daughter a story about a man who could read a creek. And the daughter had gotten up this morning and made bread and driven to Agnes Briarfield's door. Agnes got up from the table. She went to the cabinet in the front room. She opened it and took out the notebooks, all 12 of them brown leather stacked the way her father had stacked them. The oldest one with 1903 tooled into the cover in his own hand. She brought them to the kitchen table and set them down between the bread and the coffee. She said, "Sit closer. I'll need the lamp." Eudora moved her chair. The lamp came on. And for the next 3 hours on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June 1976, in a farmhouse kitchen in Calhoun County, Kansas, a 67-year-old widow opened 73 years of weather records to a 26-year-old woman whose father had once helped dig a pond and who had driven over that morning with bread and a question and the kind of attention that made Agnes feel for the first time in a long time that she was not carrying what she knew entirely alone. Eudora Hanley left at 11 o'clock that morning with her empty basket and her hair coming loose from its knot, and a piece of paper in her hand on which Agnes had drawn in pencil a rough sketch of the dam, the gauge stake, and the line where a ditch might run if someone wanted to carry water east along the lower edge of a field. She left with 73 years of weather in her head. Agnes watched her walk down the porch steps and across the gravel to her own pickup and climb in and sit for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Then Eudora started the truck and drove down the lane without looking back. Agnes stood on the porch until the truck had gone past the sycamore and out onto the county road and disappeared in the direction of Creek Bend. She went back inside. She sat at the table where the notebooks were still spread open, and the lamp was still burning, and the coffee was cold, and the bread was mostly gone. She looked at the notebooks for a moment. Then she stacked them the way her father had always stacked them, oldest on the left, and carried them back to the cabinet in the front room. She went out to the creek. Nesbitt was already there, working the morning while the temperature was still manageable, setting the upper course of stones along the east side of the wall. He did not look up when Agnes arrived. He handed her the packing bar without being asked. They worked in silence for the rest of the morning, which was how they worked most mornings, because the work had its own language, and that language did not require words to be understood. The summer of 1976 moved at the pace that serious work moved, which was not slow, but was steady, and steady was its own kind of speed, when the goal was something that would outlast the season. 6 days a week. The 7th day they rested. Agnes had kept that rule since her father kept it, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. Her hands cracked open along the heels in the 2nd week of June, the skin splitting at the places that took the most pressure from the packing bar. She wrapped them in gauze before bed each night, and unwrapped them in the morning and went back to work. Nesbitt wrapped his the same way. Neither of them mentioned it to the other because it did not require mentioning. Clem Purcell drove past the work site a second time in the 2nd week of June and stopped his truck at the fence line. He called across the field asking how big she was planning to make it. Agnes told him 40 feet wide, 4 feet at the deep place, about 9 acre-feet of storage when it filled. He laughed, the chest-open laugh of a man who needed to hear himself laugh, even when the only audience was the wind. He said he was going to send his grandchildren down to swim in her puddle. Agnes looked at him the way she looked at weather. She could not change. She said, "Drive safe, Clem." She walked back to the creek. That night she wrote in her notebook. What she did not write, because she never wrote it anywhere, because some things were carried rather than recorded, was the full shape of what she knew about Clem Purcell. She had learned it in pieces over 3 years, the way information traveled in a farming county through half-sentences at the co-op, and conversations that stopped when she walked in, and the particular quality of attention that certain people directed at her land when they thought she was not watching the direction of their attention. Clem had bought the Hendricks place in 1973, the year after Walter died. He had bought the old Duran section in 1974. He had picked up 2 more smaller parcels in 1975, acquiring them quietly through the bank in Topeka, rather than through local instruments that would have made the pattern visible more quickly. Agnes's 420 acres was the last piece he needed to make his holding contiguous from the county road to the ridge. She had not told Nesbitt this when she told him how much rock they needed. She had been sitting with it since the previous winter, turning it over the way she turned over weather patterns in her father's notebooks, looking at the shape of it, understanding what it meant before deciding what to do about it. What it meant was straightforward. Clem Purcell was laughing at a woman whose land he intended to buy. His laughter was not simply the laughter of a man who thought her project was foolish. It was the laughter of a man who believed she would fail, and that her failure would eventually bring her to his door. Agnes had thought about this for several months. She had decided to build the dam anyway. Not to prove him wrong, though, she understood that proof would eventually arrive whether she sought it or not. But because the dam was not about Clem Purcell, the dam was about Walter in the south field and Boyd in the north field, and her father's gauge stake and 3 promises made on a hot August afternoon. Clem Purcell was weather. The dam was a response to something older and more serious than any one man's ambitions. She told Nesbitt one morning in early July, while they were moving the last of the limestone slabs from the quarry on the east fence. She said it plainly, and without preamble, the way she said most things. She said, "Clem Purcell has been buying land around us for 3 years. Mine is the last piece he needs." Nesbitt set his end of the slab down and straightened up and looked at her. He asked, "Does he know you know?" She said no. "And that's fine." Nesbitt picked up his end of the slab again. He said, "All right, Mrs. Briarfield." They carried the slab down to the creek. The dam was finished in the first week of October. Agnes stood on the crest the evening it was complete and looked at what they had built. 40 feet wide, 4 feet high at the center, where the water would be deepest limestone face and clay-packed core, and an oak spillway on the north end where the bank rose slightly. Cut from planks Nesbitt had saved from the old granary boards, the sycamore stood behind her, older than anything else in the view. The creek came down from the northwest and met the wall and slowed and turned and backed up behind it in the particular way that water backed up when it encountered something it could not immediately solve. The pool was already beginning to form. Agnes put her hand on the top stone of the center course. She had set this stone herself on a Tuesday afternoon in August with Nesbitt holding the packing bar and the sun directly overhead and the sweat running down the inside of her arms. It was a heavy slab, almost more than she could manage, and she had managed it anyway because if she did not set at least one of them with her own hands, she would have asked for a thing to be built rather than building it. She did not pray. She had stopped praying in 1971, the August after Walter died, on a Sunday afternoon when she had concluded that whatever was listening was not listening to her in particular, and that she was better served by listening to the creek than by speaking into the sky. She thought about her father. She thought about Boyd. She thought about Walter. She thought about Emmett in Wichita, who had sent a letter that used Clem Purcell's name as if it were a name that belonged in the same sentence as fairness. She thought about Eudora Hanley driving away in June with her basket and the piece of paper, and 73 years of weather in her head. She thought they do not know yet. She thought they will. She took her hand off the stone. She walked back to the house. She lit the lamp and opened the notebook and wrote the date and the pool depth at the gauge and the estimated storage and a note about the spillway. And at the bottom of the entry she wrote one more line. "They are still laughing. They haven't seen anything yet." Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. The summer of 1977 came in dry. Not catastrophic, not yet. Just dry in the way that a farming county felt dryness before it became a word anyone was willing to say out loud. The kind of dry that was present in the April rains being thin and the May rains stopping on the 18th and June being hot from the first day. Agnes watched it with the attention of someone who had been watching the same patterns for 50 years and recognized the shape of what she was seeing. On the morning of the 3rd of July, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge of the county road, Agnes walked down to the pool with Nesbitt at her side. The water behind the dam had reached 9 feet and 4/10 acre-feet, which was above what she had projected for the first year, and told her that the limestone shelf was holding better than she had hoped, and the clay packing had sealed without significant loss over the winter. She had cut the ditch in May, 14 inches wide, 12 inches deep, running along the east edge of the bottom field for 800 yards, from the dam to the lower corner of the 80-acre corn planting. She and Nesbitt had cut it with a single bottom plow and a tile spade over 4 days in the second week of May. Agnes lifted the wooden gate by its iron handle. The water came. It came slowly, which was how she had designed it, to come a controlled release, rather than a rush moving at the pace that allowed it to sink into the soil between the rows, rather than run along the surface and carry topsoil with it. It ran the length of the corn rows, and it sank into the ground between the plants, and the plants drank. Nesbit stood 20 feet downstream with a shovel monitoring the flow. Agnes stood at the gate and watched the water move. She watched it for an hour. She did not say anything, and Nesbit did not say anything. The sun came up. The corn drank. That was July. By the third week of August, the difference was visible from the county road. You could stand at the corner where the county road crossed the section line and look north and see on the right side a field of corn that was tall and dark green and standing straight and full. The kind of corn that made a person think of years when everything went right. And on the left side of the same view, you could see corn that was alive, but tired corn that had been asking for something it had not received and was managing without it, in the way that things managed without what they needed, which was poorly and at a cost. Roy Hanley drove past that corner 4 times a week. He stopped driving past it. He started taking the longer route home, the one that added 2 miles but did not pass the corner, where the comparison was visible from the road. But he drove past it once more in the second week of August on a Saturday afternoon when he had not planned to and was not thinking about where he was going. And he pulled the truck onto the shoulder and sat in the cab for 10 minutes with both hands on the wheel and did not say a word to himself or to anyone. When he got home for supper, Eudora looked at his face. She said, "You drove past her place." He said, "I did." She said, "What did you see?" He said, "She's right." He said it the way a man said something he did not yet know how to carry flat, and without embellishment, the words themselves doing the entire work, because there were no additional words available yet. Eudora Hanley did not say, "I told you." She did not say it because she was 27 years old, and Roy was 29, and they had 2 small children and a mortgage at First Savings Bank of Calhoun. And she understood that the thing she had wanted him to see for 15 months, he had now seen with his own eyes, which was better than being told. Things a person saw with their own eyes stayed with them differently than things they were told. She poured him coffee. She let him sit. That night, after the children were in bed, Roy pulled a piece of newsprint from the kitchen drawer and a pencil from the cup by the sink and sat at his own table and began to draw. He drew his creek. He drew the place where the limestone shelved from the east bank. He drew where a wall might go. Eudora watched him from the doorway. She had learned in 7 years of marriage when not to interrupt. The harvest of 1977 came in. The county average for corn was 53 bushels to the acre. Agnes Briarfield's bottom, 80 the acres she had run water on from the 3rd of July to the 2nd of September, came in at 112. She paid her note at First Savings on the 12th of November. She drove home. She wrote in the notebook, "Bottom field 112, pool drawdown for the season 4.8 acre feet. Refill projected by April." She stopped. She added one more line in smaller letters. Walter would have liked this number. December came in cold. December was always cold in Calhoun County. Cold in the comprehensive way of a Kansas winter that had been practicing since October and had arrived by December at the full expression of what it intended. On the 24th of December, 1977, a truck came up the lane. Agnes was in the kitchen rolling pie dough. She had not made a pie in 2 years, not since the last Christmas before that. And she had woken that morning with no explanation and no particular decision having been made, and simply begun making a pie. Because that was what you did on Christmas Eve, if you were Agnes Briarfield. She heard the truck and put down the rolling pin. She walked to the front room and looked out the window. The truck was a brown Chevrolet she did not recognize. It came up the lane slowly, which was how people came up a lane when they were not certain of their welcome. It stopped in front of the porch. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was tall, 40 years old, approximately with Walter's shoulders and her father's chin, and the particular way of moving that she recognized before she had processed that she was recognizing it, the recognition happening in the body first, and the mind catching up a half-second later. It was her son. Emmett Briarfield, who had not been on this property since August of 1968, stood in the driveway in the snow in a wool overcoat she had never seen before, and looked up at the porch and saw her at the window. He raised one hand, just one hand, palm open, a small incomplete gesture that contained more than his face showed. The passenger door opened. A young woman got out. Brown coat, brown hair pinned up the careful eyes of someone who had prepared herself for a visit that might be complicated. The back door opened. A small boy came out, 5 years old. Red coat, red mittens holding the woman's hand, and looking around at the snow with the complete attention of a child who found everything equally interesting. Agnes put her hand against the glass. Emmett walked up the steps alone, leaving his wife and son in the driveway. He stopped at the door. He took off his hat. He looked at her through the glass. She opened the door. She did not hug him. She was not capable of it yet. Her body not having caught up with the complicated fact of him standing here. He said, "Mama." She said, "Emmett." He said, "I should have called." She said, "You should have." He said, "Can we come in?" She stepped back and held the door and said, "Bring the boy in out of the cold." His wife was Adele. His son was Harlan, named for his great-grandfather. 5 years old, round face, brown eyes that did something to the inside of Agnes's chest when she first properly looked at them. The boy looked like Boyd at 5. Not in a way she could have explained to anyone. In a way she simply knew. She made hot chocolate for Harlan and let him sit on a stool at the end of the counter and watch her finish the pie. She gave him a scrap of dough to play with, and he rolled it into a snake, and she put the snake in the oven on a piece of wax paper with the pie. When the pie came out, so did the snake, golden brown and perfect, and his face, when he saw it, was a face Agnes had not been prepared for on Christmas Eve, and she had to turn away for a moment and get herself back. She came back. That evening, after Adele had taken the boy upstairs and his footsteps had stopped, and the house had taken on the particular quiet of a place where a child was sleeping, Emmett stayed at the kitchen table. He had not said anything about the dam. He had not said anything about the cartoon at the co-op or the letter he had sent in 1976. He had sat in his father's chair by the front room stove and held his coffee and watched his mother and his wife and his son in the kitchen, and been quiet in a way Agnes had not seen in him before. He had not been a quiet boy. He had been a loud and energetic and occasionally exhausting boy. This quiet was something he had learned after he became a man. Agnes poured more coffee and sat across from him. She waited. She had learned patience from her father and from the creek, and from 6 years of carrying what she knew through a community that had not yet been ready to receive it. And patience had many applications. Emmett looked at the lamp between them. He said, "I found the letter." She said, "Which one?" He said, "The one you wrote in 1968. The one I never answered. The one explaining why you and Daddy wouldn't sell." She set down her cup. He said, "I found it in October. I was looking for something else in the box where I keep papers. It was at the bottom. I had kept it without knowing why." She said, "I didn't think you kept those." He said, "I kept all of them." She said, "Oh." Then Emmett said, the thing he had come to say, the thing Agnes understood had been the real reason for the truck in the driveway and the wool overcoat she had never seen before, and the boy in the red mittens. He said, "Mama, I should have come home for the funeral." She said nothing. He said, "I have told myself for 6 years that I had reasons. That work was the reason. That Adele had been tired that fall. That the drive was long. I have told myself all of it except the truth." She waited. He said, "I was angry because I had asked you and Daddy to sell the land, and you said no, and I moved to Wichita to get away from that no. And when he died, I told myself I didn't owe him a funeral." He said it all in one breath, the way a man said something he had been not saying for a long time, and had decided to say completely, or not at all. Agnes did not move. The wind was outside pressing against the kitchen window. The lamp burned between them. The house was quiet with Harlan sleeping upstairs. She said very quietly, "He did not blame you." Emmett said, "Yes, he did." Agnes said, "No, Lawrence. He was hurt. Hurt is not the same thing as blame. He died hurt. But he did not die angry with you." Emmett put his face in his hands. He did not cry out loud. He was a Briarfield. Briarfield men cried the way Briarfield men did most things, quietly, and with their hands involved covering what they could cover, while the rest of them worked through what could not be covered. Agnes reached across the table. She did not take his hand. She put her own hand palm down on the table between them. After a moment, his hand came out from his face and rested on top of hers. They sat that way for a while. The lamp burned. The wind moved. After a time, she said, "Emmett, I need to tell you something about your father." He looked up. She said he did not die of a bad heart. The doctor said he did, and that is what the certificate says, and I have never corrected it, because correcting it would have required telling the story. And I was not ready to tell the story. She said 1971 was a drought year. You were already gone. Your father worked 18 hours a day from June to September, trying to keep the ground alive. He was 62 years old. He had a heart that had always been a little unreliable, and he knew it. He worked anyway because he was afraid of the bank and afraid of losing what your grandfather built on this land. She drew a breath. She said he died in the south field on the 11th of August with the tractor running. I found him. I stayed with him until they came. And standing there, I made 3 promises. To your grandfather's memory. To your father. To your Uncle Boyd. She said, I promised that no one on this land would be killed by a dry year again. She stopped. She said, that is what the dam is, Emmett. Not a project. Not something to prove. A promise I made to the dead on a hot afternoon in a field your grandfather planted, and your father worked his whole life, and your uncle died in. The room was very still. Emmett said, why didn't you tell me? She said, because I needed you to come back on your own. He looked at her. She said, and you came back on your own. Tonight. You drove up the lane yourself. He put his head down again. She put her hand on the back of his neck. Her son's neck, which was thin when he was small, and which was thick now with the muscle of a grown man, and which she had not touched in 9 years. She held her hand there. She said, it's all right, Emmett. She said it is. The pie was on the counter. Adele came downstairs at 9 and found them at the table with empty cups, and the lamp burned low, and had the specific intelligence of a woman who knew when a conversation had happened that needed to have happened, and did not ask about it. She said, the pie smells wonderful, Mrs. Briarfield. Agnes said, Elenena, or Agnes, either one, please. Adele said, Agnes. Agnes said, sit with us. They sat, the 3 of them at the table. They did not eat the pie that night. They saved it for Christmas morning. When Adele had gone back upstairs and the stairs were quiet, Emmett said I would like to learn it. The land, the notebooks, how the dam works. Agnes said it would take years. He said I have years. She said I am 68 this winter. He said I know. She said Nesbit is 63. He said I know. She said, Emmett, don't promise me anything tonight. Tonight is Christmas Eve. The promises can wait until the ground is soft. He said, come back in the spring. She said, come back in April when the creek is up. We'll start then. He said, all right. That was the unspoken agreement sitting between them on the kitchen table next to the cold coffee cups and the lamp burning down to its last hour. The summer of 1978 began dry and wrong. The April rains did not come, which was a sentence that a person read differently, depending on how many Aprils they had measured, and Agnes had measured 53 of them. The May rains stopped early. June was hot from the first day. Nobody talked about it much at the co-op. Farmers waited. They watched the sky, and they watched the fields, and they counted their wood and their water. And they did not say the word out loud, because saying it was a kind of invitation, and nobody wanted to extend that invitation. Thaddeus Briggs took down the second cartoon in the first week of July. He did it without ceremony, without announcement, in the early morning before anyone had come in for coffee. He just took it down and put it in the trash. The first cartoon stayed up. Thaddeus was not yet ready to take down the first cartoon, because he was not yet ready to admit what taking it down would mean. Agnes noticed it was gone. She said nothing. By the second week of July, 4 women had begun coming to Agnes's kitchen table on Friday mornings. Eudora had brought the first one in early spring, a woman named Hazel Truitt, who had heard from Eudora that Agnes Briarfield was teaching farm wives to read the weather. Hazel had asked Eudora at the Tuesday quilting circle at the Lutheran church, where women exchanged information on subjects their husbands were not covering, whether the teaching was real, or whether it was the kind of thing people said about eccentric neighbors, to make them seem more interesting. Eudora said, come next Friday. Hazel came. Then Hazel brought someone else. Then there were 4 of them sitting at Agnes's table with the notebooks spread open, and the lamp on and the coffee in their cups going cold, because they were too interested in what they were reading to remember to drink it. Agnes did not lecture them. She opened the notebooks and let them ask questions, and she answered the questions, and she wrote in pencil on separate sheets what each of them would need to begin their own record. She showed them how her father had read the gauge and what the numbers meant in relation to the rainfall column, and the frost dates and the annual pattern that revealed itself not in any single year, but across the long run of years the way truth revealed itself in most things. Hazel Truitt was 31 years old, and her husband Roscoe farmed 190 acres of mixed corn and milo on the south end of the county. She had been at the co-op the previous spring when a joke was made about Briarfield Waterworks, and she had looked at Roscoe to see if he laughed, and he had laughed, and she had gone home and not spoken to him until the following morning. On the second Friday of August, she looked up from the 1934 notebook, the year of the worst drought in the county's recorded history, and she looked at Agnes directly. She said, this is happening again, isn't it? Agnes said yes. Hazel said, how bad? Agnes said, not as bad as 34. Not yet. But the shape of it is the same shape. Hazel said, what do I tell Roscoe? Agnes said, you tell him to dig. Anything that holds water he didn't have last year. A pond, a ditch, a diversion, anything. Hazel said he won't listen to me. Agnes said he will. He won't say he is. But he will. Hazel went home and did not say anything for 3 days. On the 4th day at breakfast, she set a piece of paper down on the table beside Roscoe's coffee cup. On the paper, she had drawn in her own hand a sketch of his creek and a possible location for a small earthen pond on the south end of his property. Roscoe Truitt looked at the paper. He looked at his wife. He looked at the paper again. He said, "Did Agnes Briarfield draw this?" Hazel said, "I drew it." He said, "Did she help you?" She said, "She taught me how to look." I drew it. Roscoe Truitt was 41 years old. He was a man who had laughed at Briarfield Waterworks in the spring of 1976 and in the summer of 1997, and who was beginning in August of 1978 to understand that he had been laughing at something he did not understand. He picked up the paper. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "I'll think on it." He did not laugh. That was the shape of the change in Calhoun County in the summer of 1978. Slow, quiet, happening around kitchen tables and between husbands and wives. Through paper passed without comment through young men driving past Agnes Briarfield's bottom field and pulling off the road to sit with their hands on the wheel. And then on the night of the 22nd of August, the change took a different form entirely. The thunderstorm came out of the southwest at 10 minutes to 3 in the morning. It came hot and dry, the kind of storm that arrived in a drought year, when the air had been starved of moisture for so long that the lightning had nowhere to find ground. The kind that came without rain and left fires. Agnes woke to a sound she did not immediately recognize. A low boom, not thunder's usual roll. Something shorter, more final. She went to the window. On the eastern horizon, in the direction of Clem Purcell's property 3/4 of a mile across the creek, and the county road, the sky held color that had no business being in the sky at 3 in the morning. Orange. The specific orange that a farmer who had spent 69 years on this land knew before she had finished the thought. Fire. She stood at the window for 2 seconds. 2 seconds. She thought that man laughed at you for 2 years. That man called your work a puddle from his truck window. That man has been quietly trying to buy your land out from under you since your husband died. She thought all of it. It took 2 seconds. Then she pulled her dress on over her nightgown and her boots on without socks and went down the stairs and hit the wall outside Nesbitt's bunkroom twice with the flat of her hand and called his name. Nesbitt was up in 12 seconds. He was 64 years old, and he was up in 12 seconds because he was that kind of man. They took the truck. Agnes drove. They went east on the gravel, past the creek, past the section line, past the fence corner, where the first cartoon had not yet been thought of 2 years before. They came up the Purcell Lane at 3:08 in the morning. The barn was gone. That part was already finished. The lightning had hit the old gambrel roof sometime before 3, and by 3:08 the barn was a frame of black sticks, and the equipment inside was shapes that used to be useful things, and there was nothing to be done about the barn. The house was the question. 40 feet from the barn. The wind out of the southwest at 18 miles an hour, carrying sparks. Clem Purcell was standing in his front yard, in his pajama bottoms and a white undershirt and no shoes. He was holding the garden hose in both hands and pointing it at the roof of his house. The garden hose was producing a stream of water that was thin and weak and almost completely useless because his well had been dropping all summer, and his pressure was less than half of normal. And what came out of that hose was approximately what you would get if you asked a man to spit at a house fire. He looked like a man trying to change the outcome of something that had already been decided. Vivian Purcell was on the porch, 58 years old in her robe and slippers holding a quilt against her chest. Her mother had made the quilt. Agnes knew this somehow the way you knew things about your neighbors after 20 years of proximity. The particular objects that belonged to particular people and had come to stand for something about those people. Vivian was not crying. She was past crying. She was standing with the quilt against her chest, watching her husband try to save the house with a garden hose, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had spent everything available to her and was now waiting. Agnes pulled the truck up. Nesbit was out before the truck had fully stopped. Agnes was out 1 second behind him. She did not say anything to Clem. She did not even look at him. She went to the back of the truck, and she and Nesbit pulled out the coil of fire hose that Henry had bought for the threshing crew. In 1968, the hose Agnes had carried in the back of the pickup every summer since, because her father had said once that fire was the only thing that frightened a farmer more than drought. And she had decided after Walter died that she was not going to be caught without the answer to either one. They unspooled it. Nesbit connected one end to the spigot on the side of the Purcell house. Agnes connected the other end to the spigot on the water tank she carried in the truck bed. 200 gallons of water she had hauled every summer morning since 1971. Because that was the year she had understood in the South Field what being without water cost. She turned the valve. The hose filled. The pressure was real. Agnes picked up the nozzle, and she walked to where Clem was standing with his garden hose and the thin, useless stream, and she held the fire hose out to him. She did not say a word. He looked at her for half a second, something moving through his face that she did not take time to read. Then he took the nozzle and turned and started spraying the roof. Nesbit had already begun another line from the tank to the porch. Agnes walked up the porch steps. She went to Vivian. She did not say it was going to be all right. She did not say, "Don't cry." She did not say anything. She put her arms around the woman whose husband had drawn a cartoon of her life and pinned it to a corkboard for the entertainment of Calhoun County. The woman who had baked a casserole for Agnes the same week Darrell had come up her lane with his sympathetic smile and his real estate ambitions. The woman Agnes had lived 3/4 of a mile from for 20 years and had never once spoken to about anything that mattered. Vivian Purcell made a sound. It was small and terrible, the sound that came out of a person when they had been holding something back for a long time, and the holding back was no longer possible. She put her face into Agnes's shoulder. Agnes held her. Behind them, the men worked the hoses. The wind shifted at 3:22 in the morning, swinging from the southwest to the north for 2 full minutes. And in those 2 minutes, the sparks that had been crossing toward the house stopped. Crossing toward the house, and Nesbit got the porch wet enough that the next sparks didn't catch, and Clem soaked the near side of the roof. By 4 in the morning, the barn was a pile of settling embers, and the house was standing wet, and the wind had calmed, and the storm had been threatening all night, still had not come because this was a drought year, and the rain was not coming, but the fire was out. Vivian was sitting on the porch steps with the quilt on her lap. Clem was standing in the yard with the nozzle hanging at his side and water running off his face and down his neck, and the blank expression of a man looking at what used to be his barn. Agnes walked down off the porch and crossed the yard. She stopped 6 feet from him. He turned to look at her. He had soot on his face. He had no shoes on. He was 62 years old at that moment, and he looked 80. And he looked underneath the exhaustion and the loss and the shock of the night, like a man in the middle of understanding something he did not yet have words for. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. She said, "Clem, go to bed." He said, "Agnes." She said, "Go to bed. You can think tomorrow. Right now, Go to bed." He looked at her for 3 seconds, which was long enough for her to see the thing she had not seen on his face before. Not the confidence, not the amusement, not the particular expression of a man who had decided the outcome before the conversation started. Just a man. She turned. She walked back to the truck. Nesbit was already coiling the hose. They drove home in the dark without speaking because there was nothing that needed speaking. And the silence between two people who had worked together for 19 years was not absence, but presence. The sun came up at 6:14. Agnes did not go back to bed. She made coffee and drank it on the porch in her nightgown and her dress and her boots, and she watched the eastern sky lighten over the fields and the creek and the limestone face of the dam that held water enough to see her through. Another dry summer. And she did not cry, and she did not write in the notebook, and she did not pray. She wrote in the notebook 2 days later when she had her breath back. She wrote August 22nd, 1978. Purcell barn struck by lightning. Nesbit and I drove the truck tank over. We got the house wet. The barn was lost. Vivian is unsteady. Clem is unsteady. Neither one of them is the same as they were yesterday. She stopped. She added one more line in smaller letters. A woman cried on my shoulder tonight, who I have never once spoken to in 20 years of living 3/4 of a mile from each other. I do not understand how a person lives that long beside another person and never says a word. I am 69 years old, and I am only beginning to understand this. She closed the notebook. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was still 6 weeks away. The corn was in. The pool behind the dam was down 4.6 acre-feet from its July high, which was less drawdown than she had projected for a dry year, which meant the clay packing had held better than even her best estimate. Eudora Hanley came on Friday morning with the bread. She came with 2 other women now, Hazel Truitt and a young woman named Winifred Doss, whose husband had not yet agreed to dig anything but who was going to agree, Agnes believed, before the following spring arrived. They sat at the table. They drank coffee. They read the notebooks. Agnes poured and answered questions and wrote down what each of them needed to write down before the Friday ended. And at the table she felt something she had not named yet, something that had been growing since the morning Eudora first came to the door with her basket and her question. It was the feeling of no longer carrying what she knew entirely alone. The knowledge was still hers. The 73 years of readings were still in her notebooks and in her memory and in the muscles of her arms from 50 years of kneeling at a creek bank. But it was also in Eudora's hands now, and in Hazel's, and beginning to be in Winifred's. And what was in other people's hands was not diminished for being shared. Her father had taught her that. He had taught her by teaching 2 children instead of 1 just in case. Because the knowledge had always been bigger than any single person, and the land had always required more than any single generation to understand. She had been carrying it forward the way he carried it forward. The same table, the same lamp, the same question asked and answered across the years, one generation to the next, until the next generation had enough to ask their own questions. Outside, the first dry summer of the rest of what was coming was settling into its end. The dam held. The water held. And somewhere in a farm kitchen 3 miles east, Roscoe Truitt had taken his wife's drawing out of his shirt pocket for the 3rd time that week and spread it flat on the table and looked at it with the attention of a man who was going to dig a pond before winter came, even if he had not yet said so out loud. Even if he would never say out loud that the idea had come from his wife. Even if the telling of it afterward would make no mention of the Friday morning kitchen, or the notebooks or the women who had been meeting there all summer, while the county waited for rain that was not coming. Some changes announced themselves. Others simply arrived like water finding the path that had been prepared for it without fanfare and without ceremony, because the path was there and the water was ready, and the two of them understood each other. The winter of 1981 came in without snow worth measuring. Agnes wrote that down on the 1st of January 1982. The way she wrote everything down, with the date and the observation and the number that went with it, because numbers were more honest than impressions, and impressions were more honest than hope. January trace. February trace. March, half an inch that came down in 2 events a week apart and did not penetrate the subsoil enough to matter. She had seen this shape before, not in her own lifetime, not this shape at this speed, but in the notebooks, in the columns her father had kept through the early 30s. The years when the sky forgot how to give back what the ground needed. She had read those pages so many times she could have recited the numbers without opening the covers. She had read them as a young woman learning the land, and as a middle-aged woman understanding the land, and now as a 72-year-old woman who had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who had done the arithmetic and knew what the arithmetic eventually produced for the year that would confirm what she had been seeing in the trend for a decade. This was that year. She was not happy about being right. She had never wanted to be right about this. She had wanted 20 times if she had wanted it once for the numbers to tell a different story, for the wet years to hold, for the cycle to break in the direction of abundance rather than absence. She had taken her readings and done her math and hoped in the private way she hoped for things that required more than effort to achieve that she was misreading the pattern. She was not misreading it. April brought 4 rains, all of them under a 1/4 inch. The soil going into May was already short in the top 18 inches, where the roots of a corn plant did most of their work. May brought 3 rains, none of them over 1/3 of an inch, 2 of them arriving as the leading edge of systems that promised more and then moved north without delivering it. June was dry from the first day to the last. Agnes measured Kettle Creek on the morning of the 28th of June. She stood at the gauge stake the way she had stood at gauge stakes for 57 years. Her boots in the water, her knotted rope in her left hand. The summer light coming through the sycamore leaves in the particular way it came in late June, when the days were at their longest. She measured. She wrote the number down. She looked at the number. She closed her eyes. The number she had just written was the lowest reading she had recorded since 1936. The worst year of the worst decade. The year her father had written in his notebook in the careful script he used even for the worst news that the creek had gone to nothing above the limestone shelf, and that he did not know yet what they would do. He had known what to do. He had done it. He had survived. And the land had survived, and the knowledge of how to survive had come down to Agnes through his hands and his notebooks, and 40 years of Saturday mornings at a creek bank. She opened her eyes. She wrote below the gauge, reading, "Here it is." She walked back to the house. Nesbitt was on the porch in the rocker he had moved there after his stroke 3 years ago. The year he had come back from the hospital with his left foot dragging slightly, and his left arm working slow, and his absolutely unchanged opinion that his place was on this farm, and not in his daughter's house in Topeka. Agnes had not argued with him about this because Nesbitt was right, and because arguing with Nesbitt about a thing he had decided was like arguing with the creek about which way it ran. She said Nesbitt. He said Mrs. Briarfield. She said, "Get Jesse. Tell him the ditch is opening today. All of it. The east extension, too." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He stood up from the rocker. He stood up slowly, the way he stood up from everything now. the left side taking longer than the right to organize itself for the task. He said, "Mrs. Briarfield." She said, "What?" He said, "Purcell's gonna come." She looked at the fields toward the east, toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the property line between her land and the land Clem Purcell had been accumulating since 1973. She had been waiting for this summer since the winter she had understood the trend in the numbers. She had been waiting for Clem Purcell to come to her door since the morning she had put the fire hose in his hands in 1978 and driven home in the dark without saying anything that needed to be said yet. She said, "I know he is." Nesbit said, "What are you going to do when he does?" She looked at the cottonwoods for a moment. She said, "I am going to give him water, Nesbit." He said, "How much?" She said, "Whatever I can spare." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He walked off the porch toward the barn, where Jesse Holt would be starting the morning work. Jesse was 23 years old. The young man Roland Mossman, of all people, had sent up Agnes's lane in 1979 with the words, "I hear you might be looking for someone." Jesse had come in a clean shirt that did not fit his shoulders quite right, and had sat at the kitchen table and looked at Nesbit and said, "Ma'am and sir," and had been here ever since. Sleeping in the bunk room on the south side of the barn, eating at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, learning everything Nesbit had to teach him, with the focused attention of a young man who understood that what he was being given was more than a job. Nesbit walked toward the barn with his left foot dragging its slight trail in the dust of the yard. Agnes watched him go. She did not go inside. She stood on the porch in the June morning and looked at the pool behind the dam, visible from here, as a line of still water between the stones and the sycamore, 8 feet and 2 inches deep. At the gauge stake, more water stored than any other single piece of ground in the county. She had built it from a promise and a measuring rope and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been told her whole life what she could not do, and had spent her whole life demonstrating the inadequacy of that information. The drought ran 14 weeks. By the 3rd week of July, the talk at the co-op had changed. Not in subject, the subject was the same subject, the weather and the water and the count of what remained, and the arithmetic of what was going to be needed. But the quality of the talk had changed. It was quieter. The certainty had gone out of it. The men who gathered around Thaddeus Briggs's pot-bellied stove were men who were counting things they did not have enough of, and trying not to let the counting show on their faces. And men who were doing that kind of counting did not also have energy available for the performance of confidence. Thaddeus Briggs had taken down the first cartoon in early July. He had not announced it. He had taken it down during the early morning before anyone arrived, the same way he had taken down the second one 4 years before. Agnes noticed it was gone when she came in for pencils on the second Friday. She bought her pencils and paid in cash and went home. She did not say anything about the cartoon being gone. By the 2nd week of August, Roscoe Truitt had lost his first corn planting. The replanting he had done in late June at reduced density was suffering. Owen Mossman, who was 61 and had not slept more than 4 hours a night since May, had watched 120 acres of dryland corn past the point of recovery. 3 farmers on the south end of the county had driven to the state agricultural office and used a word that nobody at the co-op was yet willing to say in front of each other. Agnes's pool was at 8 feet 2 inches. Agnes's ditch was running. Her 120 irrigated acres, the original 80 plus, the 40 she and Nesbit and Jesse had added, with Roy Hanley's help in the spring of 1980, went into August with full ears setting on the stalks and the particular dark green of corn that had been drinking. The Friday women had stopped asking whether the drought was serious. They were asking what to do. There were 9 of them now. Eudora Hanley still came every Friday morning with the bread which had become the ritual that marked the beginning of the meeting, the way the gauge reading marked the beginning of Agnes's notebook entries. Not the point, but the container that held the point. Hazel Truitt came. A woman named Iola Pruitt, whose husband had finally in March begun digging the small pond at the corner of his cornfield that Hazel had talked about for 2 years. 3 women whose husbands had already started making changes before the drought confirmed the need for them. 2 women whose husbands had not yet started, and who came to the Friday table anyway because they had decided that not knowing was worse than knowing even when the knowing was hard. And a young woman named June Vetter, whose husband had refused to discuss water storage of any kind, and who came with her sister's daughter. A 20-year-old biology student from the university in Lawrence, who took notes in a spiral notebook and asked questions that were technically more precise than Agnes could always answer, and who was going to do something important with what she was learning here. Agnes believed, though she could not yet see what shape that something would take. 9 women. Agnes poured the coffee. Eudora brought the bread. They did not ask whether it was happening anymore. They asked what to do next. On the 4th Friday of July, 1982, someone knocked on Agnes's front door. She was at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, calculating the remaining storage in the pool against the projected demands of August and September, doing the arithmetic that she had been doing every summer for 6 years, the arithmetic that told her how much she had and how long it would last and how much she could spare without compromising her own ground. She set down her pencil. She walked through the front room. She opened the door. Clem Purcell was on the porch. He had his hat in his hands. This was the second time in his life he had removed his hat in her presence, and like the first time in 1978, in the yard after the fire, the removal told her more than his face did. His face was careful, holding something in. His hat was in his hands, which told her what his face was trying to conceal. He was 66 years old. He had lost weight over the summer, the kind of weight a man lost when he was working too hard and not sleeping enough, and the worry was using more calories than the food was providing. His clean shirt was the shirt of a man who had dressed carefully, for something he understood mattered. She said, "Come in, Clem. The wind is blowing dust." He came in. She walked him through the front room to the kitchen. She moved the notebook aside. She poured him coffee. His hand was not entirely steady when he took the cup. She did not say anything about his hand. She sat down across from him. She let the silence be what it was for a moment, which was a man arriving at something he had been moving toward for a long time and needing a moment to get there all the way. He looked at the table. He looked at his coffee. He said, "I have 30 acres of first-ear corn that might still make something if it gets water in the next 2 weeks." She said nothing. He said, "Everything else is gone." She said nothing. He said, "I am not asking for charity. I will pay you whatever the water is worth. Whatever number you set is the number I will pay." She looked at him. She looked at him for a longer moment than a simple answer required, because what she was about to say was not a simple answer, and she wanted him to understand that she knew the difference. She said, "No charge." He looked up. He said, "Agnes." She said, 20 acres. That is what I can spare. I have my own ground to keep alive, and there are others who will need to come." He said, "Agnes, I will pay." She said, "Clem, no charge. Don't make me say it again." He sat with the coffee cup in his hands. His shoulders did the thing she had seen them do before the thing that happened. when a man set down something he had been carrying and had not known how heavy it was until the setting down. He did not speak for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different from the voice he had used in front of the fence line in April of 1976. That voice had been the voice of a man performing confidence for an audience. This voice had nobody in it except him. He said, "Clem, I know about the land." She said nothing. He said, "I know about the land. Say that you know. Tell me you knew." She looked at him. She said, "I have known since 1974. I knew when you bought the Duran section. I knew the shape of what you were doing before you finished doing it." He looked at the table again. She said you were laughing at a woman you were trying to buy out. You thought if you made enough noise about how foolish the project was, I would eventually believe you and quit, and the land would come to you. He said nothing. She said, "And I built the dam anyway, because the rain doesn't care what either of us thinks. And neither do I." The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the wheat stubble, the way it moved across Calhoun County in August, low and hot and without mercy. The creek was down to a trickle. The sky had the iron quality it had been holding since late June, the sky of a season that had made its decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Inside the kitchen, the coffee was getting cold between Clem Purcell's hands. He said very quietly, "When the drought breaks." She said, "When the drought breaks, you come back here. I will show you where the limestone shelves on your creek and how to set the spillway, and how to pack the core so it holds without failing. The dam you need is smaller than mine. You can build it in 6 weeks with 2 hired hands and the right stone." He looked at her. He said you would help me build it. She said I would show you how. The building is yours. He stood up. He moved toward the door and stopped in the doorway. He turned around. He said I drew the cartoon. She said, "I know you did." He said the first one, I drew it myself. I had Hollis hang it because it was more effective coming from him, but I drew it. She said, "I know." He said, "I am sorry for it." She said, "I know you are." He said, "Is there anything I can do? Anything I can say?" She looked at him standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. 66 years old. A man who had spent 6 years laughing at something he did not understand, and had spent the last 4 years understanding it, and had arrived this morning at her door with the weight of both things on him. She said, "Clem, take your time." He nodded once. He put his hat on. He went out. She listened to his truck start and back down the lane and turn onto the county road and become indistinguishable from the other sounds of an August morning in Calhoun County. She sat at the table. She did not write in the notebook for an hour. She just sat. 3 more men came in August one at a time, each on a different day of the week, each with his hat in his hands and a number on his lips, the number of acres he had that might still make something if they got water in the next 2 weeks. She gave each of them what she could spare and calculated the drawdown and adjusted her projections. Roscoe Truitt came on the Thursday morning with Hazel in the truck. Hazel, who did not get out because this was Roscoe's errand to run, and she understood that. He came up to the porch and said his pond had emptied, and he had 15 acres that might still make. Agnes gave him enough for 10. He looked at her and said, "Mrs. Briarfield, ma'am." She said, "It's all right, Roscoe. Next year, we'll draw a bigger pond." He went back to the truck. He climbed in. Agnes watched from the porch as Hazel reached over and put her hand on his arm, and the truck sat there for a moment before it pulled down the lane. The harvest of 1982 came in during October. The county average for corn was 31 bushels to the acre. 12 farmers in Calhoun County filed for emergency operating loans before the year ended. 2 farms went to the bank before Christmas. Families who had been on their land for 2 and 3 generations signed papers in offices in Topeka and drove home on roads they had traveled all their lives and tried to understand what it meant to travel them differently now. Agnes Briarfield's irrigated ground came in at 94 bushels, 20 acres of Clem Purcell's corn, the acres Jesse had run the ditch to by Thursday. As Agnes had promised, came in at 78 bushels. It was the difference approximately between Clem Purcell making his note at First Savings Bank of Calhoun County and not making it. He made it. She paid her own note on the 9th of November. Walter Crane, who ran the bank and who had not shaken her hand when she came in the year before, stood up from behind his desk when she walked in and shook her hand and said, "Mrs. Briarfield." He said it the way a man said a name when the name had come to mean something different to him than it had a year ago. She said, "Mr. Crane." She paid her note. She asked him to listen to the men who came in the spring asking for loans to dig ponds and build diversions. She told him they would be coming. She told him the bank should listen. He said the bank would listen. She drove home. On a Sunday evening in the second week of October, Clem Purcell came to her door again. This time he came to the door, not to the lane, not to the fence. He knocked. He had a small brown paper bag in one hand and his hat in the other. Vivian had sent biscuits. Agnes said, "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table. He set the bag down. He said, "Vivian sent biscuits." Agnes said, "Tell her thank you." Then he said Agnes about 1976. She said, "Clem, you said it already in August. We don't need to go through it twice." He said, "I would like to." She looked at him. She said, "All right." He said, "I laughed at you in 1976. I called it a puddle. I drew the cartoon and pinned it up and made sure the other men laughed too. I thought I was being clever. I thought I knew what the land required and I thought you didn't. And I made sure everyone around me agreed with me because that is how I had always understood being right to work, by making certain the people near me were wrong in the same direction." He stopped. He looked at the table. He said, "I have thought about that every day this summer. I have thought about it every day since the night the barn burned, if I am being honest, which I have not been until very recently." She said, "Clem." He said, "I am ashamed." She said, "I know you are." He said, "I don't know what to do with that." She said, "You build." He said, "What?" She said, "You build a wall on your creek. There is a narrowing about 100 yards north of your section line where the limestone shelves from the east bank. The shelf is wide enough to give you a foundation without cutting. You can build 40 feet of wall with the same technique I used. Stone face, clay packed core. I can show you the spillway design. You set it on the north end where the bank is a foot higher, and you leave yourself room for a 10-year flood without losing the structure." He said, "Agnes, I am 66 years old." She said, "So am I. 67 this winter. And I set the center course on my dam myself because I decided that if I didn't set at least one stone with my own hands, I would have asked for it to be built rather than building it. You set the first stone yourself, Clem. The rest can be hired." He sat with his coffee cup. He was quiet for a while. He said, "You will help me." She said, "I will lend you my drawings from 1976. Jesse will come help you set stone if you need a third pair of hands, and I will walk the site with you before you start, so you understand what you are looking at." He set the cup down. He looked at her. He said, "I don't know how to accept this." She said, "Drink your coffee, Clem." He drank his coffee. He stayed for an hour. He talked about Vivian, who was tired from the summer, who had not been sleeping well. He talked about his son, who had taken over the day-to-day of the farm this year, and who was learning. He talked about his grandson, Wyatt, who was 8 years old, and who wanted God help them to be a farmer. Agnes listened. At the door, he stopped. He said, "Agnes." She said, "What?" He said, "Vivian asks if she might come for coffee some Saturday morning." Agnes was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Tell her Saturday mornings at 9. The pot is always on." He went home. Agnes sat at the table for a long time after the sound of his truck had faded. She did not write in the notebook that night. She would write later that the drought of 1982 was over, and that they had come through, and that the bottom corn had come in at 94, and that Jesse had run the ditch to Purcell's fence by Thursday, and that Clem had made his note. She would write that Gareth had called from Wichita on Tuesday, and that he was coming back in the spring, and that she did not yet believe it, but would believe it when she saw his truck in the lane. But not that night. That night she sat at the table in the kitchen, where her father had sat, and his father before that, with the lamp burning the way it had burned through every season of her life on this land. And she felt something she had been carrying alone for 11 years begin to be a different kind of weight. The spring of 1983 came in with real rain, the kind that came down in long, slow sheets in April, and did not stop for 4 days, and soaked deep enough to matter. The pool refilled by the second week of March. The creek ran full past the gauge stake her father had driven in 1903. The wheat came up dark green, and the county extension agent wrote a letter to the state agricultural office that used the word recovery for the first time in 3 years. And on the 18th of April, a brown moving truck came up Agnes's lane. Behind it, a car. Agnes was on the porch when they came up the drive. She had been expecting them since Christmas of 1977, which meant she had been expecting them for 5.5 years, which was a long time to expect something and still not be entirely prepared for it when it arrived. Emmett got out of the truck. He was 40 years old, taller than she remembered him being the last time she had seen him, which could not be true, but was what her eyes told her. He walked up the porch steps. He took off his hat. He said, "Mama." She said, "Emmett." He said, "I sold the house. Adele resigned. I gave my notice. We're here, if you'll have us." She did not move at first. She had been standing at the door of this farmhouse her entire life. She had stood at it when her brother Boyd left for the last time in the spring of 1943. She had stood at it when her father came home from Boyd's funeral. She had stood at it when Walter left for the South Field on the morning of the 11th of August, 1971. The last morning of his life, and she had waved at him from this door, without knowing it was a wave goodbye. She had stood at this door alone for 11 years. She put her hand against the doorframe. She said, "Bring my grandson in." Adele came up with Harlan, who was 9 years old now, and who had his great-grandfather's name, and his great-uncle Boyd's eyes, and the complete physical confidence of a boy who was exactly the right size for the world he was standing in. He looked up at Agnes. Agnes went down the porch steps on her 74-year-old knees, which was not what her knees would have recommended had they been consulted, and she put both hands on his face. She said, "Do you know who I am?" He said, "Your grandma." She said, "Yes, I am." She stood up. She wiped her face once quickly with the back of her hand. She turned back to the door. She said, "All of you come in. The coffee is hot." The years that followed had the quality of things that had been prepared for and were now simply happening. Emmett learned the land. He had been keeping his own notebook since 1983. The same brown leather Agnes used, the same Dixon Ticonderoga No. 2 pencils she bought in boxes of 12 every January. He sat with her at the kitchen table every morning Agnes was teaching, and he listened and asked questions, and sometimes argued, which she found she liked the arguing of a son who had learned enough to have a real opinion. He learned the gauge. He learned the dam. He learned what Jesse had learned from Nesbit, and what Nesbit had learned from Agnes, and what Agnes had learned from her father. The whole chain of it, one generation at a time, passed forward through the hands and the notebooks and the creek bank. Nesbit Mosley died in the autumn of 1992. He died in the rocker on Agnes's porch on a Sunday afternoon in October, with his coffee cup half full and his eyes closed, and a quality of settled peace in his face that Agnes recognized before she had set down the second cup she had brought out for him. She sat beside him. She held his hand for 40 minutes before she went inside to call. She buried him on the farm, on a rise south of the dam, where you could see the pool from the headstone. She had the stone cut into pica and brought out on a flatbed truck. She paid for it herself. The stone said Nesbit Mosley, the man who carried water, 1914 to 1992. She stood at his grave alone the afternoon the stone was set, and put her hand on the top of it and said out loud, "Thank you, Nesbit." Then she went home and wrote in her notebook. She wrote, "Nesbit is buried above the creek. The stone is good. He was the best man I ever knew, my husband and my father included. And I am only saying that because both of them would have said the same thing if they were here to say it. There is no shame in it. He was the best of us." She closed the notebook. She kept it going. In April of 1991, Agnes Briarfield walked her son out to the dam. She was 82 years old. She walked with her father's cane, the one with the carved handle her mother had made for Harlan on his 75th birthday, the one Agnes had been using since the previous fall, when her right knee had made its final determination about the direction of the discussion. She walked slowly. She walked with the specific patience of a woman who had been walking to this creek her entire life and was going to keep walking to it for as long as she was able. They stood on the crest of the dam together. The pool was full. The spillway was running a thin sheet of overflow that caught the April light. The sycamore was behind them, older than anything else in the view, its trunk a measurement her father had first recorded in 1903. Agnes put her hand on the top stone of the center course. This stone, the one she had set herself on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1976, with Nesbit holding the bar and the sun straight overhead and the men in the county waiting for her to fail. She said, "Emmett, check the spillway boards every March before the runoff. Replace any board that sounds hollow when you knock on it. The clay on the north face needs repacking every 3 years. You will know when it starts to seep because the downstream face will darken before it weeps." He wrote in his notebook. She said the gauge stake is the third post east of the sycamore. Do not move it. It is in the exact location your grandfather drove it in 1903. When Harlan takes over after you tell him the same thing. He said, "I won't move it." She said, "There is a stone on the north crest, third from the east end." I said it myself. If it ever shifts, you will know something in the foundation has moved and you should look before you wait. He looked at her. She took her hand off the stone. She turned and walked back up the rise toward the house with her cane and the slow, particular walk she had learned since her knee stopped cooperating. And Emmett walked beside her. And that was the ceremony. No guests, No speeches, no formal moment of transfer. Just a woman and her son, and a walk from a dam to a farmhouse on an April morning in Kansas. Eleanor Agnes Briarfield died in her sleep in the spring of 2001. She was 92 years old. Emmett found her in the morning. The notebook was open on the bedside table. The lamp had burned down. The last entry was dated the 14th of April. She had written April rain sufficient. Pool full. Emmett runs it well. Harlan is learning fast. Eudora leads the women now. The land will stay. That was the last sentence she ever wrote. The funeral was in Calhoun at the Lutheran Church on a Thursday in May. The church held 240 people. Every pew was filled. People stood along the back wall. 3 people drove from Topeka, and 2 drove from Wichita, and 1 woman drove from Lawrence, who had been a 20-year-old biology student taking notes in a spiral notebook at Agnes's kitchen table in 1982, and who had gone on to study hydrology and now worked for the State Water Resources Office, and had spent 20 years applying things she had first understood in a farmhouse kitchen. Vivian Purcell came in a wheelchair. She was 81 years old. Clem had died the previous year in his sleep in the bedroom of the house Agnes had helped them save in 1978. Vivian's son drove her down from Topeka, and she sat in the front pew and did not cry during the service, and after it was finished, her son brought the car around and she waited in the lane. Emmett walked to her and bent down, and she took his face in her 2 thin hands, the way old women took the faces of people they needed to be close to. She said, "Your mother saved my life twice. Once, when my barn burned once, when I had cancer. There is nothing I can say that will ever be enough." Emmett said, "Vivian." She knew. Eudora Hanley spoke at the service. She was 51 years old. She had been Agnes Briarfield's student for 25 years, and she stood at the front of the church without notes and without tears, and she said what needed to be said. She said, "In June of 1976, I drove to Eleanor Briarfield's farmhouse with a basket of bread and one question. I left 3 hours later with 73 years of weather in my head and a piece of paper, and the only true teacher I have ever had in my life." She said there are 19 women in this church today who can read a creek. There are 16 working storage ponds and dams in Calhoun County. There is a way of carrying knowledge in this county that did not exist before Agnes Briarfield, and that will exist after all of us. She said she did that sitting at a kitchen table with a lamp on and a notebook open between her and another woman. She did it the way her father had done it for her, one person at a time, on a Saturday morning by the water, teaching someone to listen. She paused. She said she believed every day of her life that the land remembered what you gave it, not what you kept. That is what she gave. The wind came down off the Flint Hills that afternoon, the way it had always come crossing the wheat, crossing the creek, crossing the limestone face of the dam which was standing and would go on standing because it had been built by the right hands, on the right foundation for the right reasons. 2 years later, in the spring of 2003, a green pickup truck came up the Briarfield Lane on a Wednesday morning. Emmett was 55 years old. He was standing on the crest of the dam with his son Harlan, who was 24 and tall like his great-great-grandfather, Harlan Briarwood, whose name he carried, and whose gauge stake he tended every April on the 23rd, as the records required. They saw the truck. The truck came up to the fence at the edge of the bottom field and stopped. A young man got out. He was 22 years old. He was wearing a clean shirt and a hat that was new enough that he had not yet learned how to wear it comfortably. He stood at the fence with the hat in his hands. and the particular expression of a young man who has spent a week working up to something and is now doing it before he can change his mind. His name was Wyatt Purcell, Clem's grandson. He had been 8 years old the summer Clem Purcell had come to Agnes's kitchen door with his hat in his hands. He had inherited the farm from Clem in 2000 when Clem died, and had spent the 3 years since working it with the focused determination of a young man who understood that what he had been given had been made valuable by someone other than himself, and that he owed that someone more than he had yet been able to pay. The spring had been dry. The rain had stopped on the 5th of May. June had been hot from the first day. Wyatt's corn was burning in the July heat, and the pond his grandfather had built in the spring of 1983, on the design Agnes had drawn. The previous winter was down to 6 inches at the center, and would be dry by the end of the week. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands. He said, "Mr. Briarfield." Emmett walked down from the crest of the dam with Harlan beside him. He stopped at the fence. He looked at Wyatt Purcell, the grandson of the man who had laughed at his mother from a fence line in April of 1976. The grandson of the man who had come to her door with his hat in his hands in July of 1982 and heard her say, "Take your time." The grandson of the man who had built a dam on his own creek the following spring and run water from it through 3 dry summers before he died. Emmett looked at the young man's hands holding the hat. He said, "Mr. Purcell." Wyatt said, "I have 20 acres of first-year corn that might still make something if they get water in the next 2 weeks. Emmett looked at the pool, 6 feet 8 inches at the gauge. He looked at Harlan beside him. Harlan nodded once the same small nod Nesbitt Mosley had given Agnes Briarfield in an equipment shed in May of 1976, the nod of someone who had calculated the situation and understood what it required. Emmett said, "I can give you enough for 15. Wyatt said, "Mr. Briarfield, I will pay whatever." Emmett said, "No charge." Wyatt looked at him. Emmett said, "My son here will run the ditch to your west fence by Thursday. Tell your wife Saturday mornings at 9. The pot is always on." Wyatt's hat was shaking slightly in his hands. He said, "Yes, sir." He turned and climbed back into the green pickup. He drove down the lane. He turned onto the county road and drove east toward his own farm. Harlan stood at the fence beside his father. He was 24 years old. He had Agnes's eyes and her patience and her specific quality of attention that registered everything without requiring it to be named. He said, "She wrote about this, didn't she? The cycle. The grandsons coming to the fence." Emmett said, 1984, page 71. She had written, "The work is not finished until the children of the men who laughed are the children who come to the fence." They walked back up the rise together toward the white farmhouse where the coffee was on, and the notebooks were in the cabinet in the front room, and the lamp was on the kitchen table. That evening, in the kitchen of Wyatt Purcell's farm 3 miles east, his wife sat across from him at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee. She said, "There is a woman who teaches. Her name is Eudora Hanley. She sits at the Briarfield kitchen table on Friday mornings. I have been told she is very good." Wyatt was tired. He was 22 years old, and he was tired in the specific way of a young man who had spent a summer watching something he could not control take more than he had expected to lose. But he looked at his wife, and he saw what she was asking, and he understood in the way that young men sometimes understood things when the thing was simple enough, and the day had made them honest enough what the asking meant. He said, "Go." She went. The following Friday morning, she drove to the Briarfield farmhouse and knocked on the front door. Harlan answered. She told him her name. He smiled and said, "Come in. The coffee is on. There is bread." She came in. She sat at the kitchen table with 8 other women, and Eudora Hanley opened a notebook in front of her, one of the brown leather notebooks from the cabinet in the front room, and the lamp came on. Outside the window, the pool behind the dam held its water in the July heat, as it had held its water through every drought since 1977, patient and indifferent and full of what had been given to it. The land remembered what you gave it. Agnes Briarfield had been right about that the whole time.